Thank you very much indeed, Fabian, and thank you very much to the European Policy Centre for inviting me along today. And Fabian is actually a great example of European cooperation, because I think you did your PhD in Edinburgh, which is the city of my birth. You then married a Scot. You're from Germany, but you're living in Brussels. It's pretty good. I hope it's all working out for you anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my speech, and then we'll have time for question and answer. And I want to start by saying that Brexit is momentous and life-changing for Britain. The British people should be given a final say on whatever deal is negotiated. If they are allowed that say, then Brexit can be averted. And I and many others will work passionately for that outcome. But today, I want to say here in Brussels why Brexit is also bad for Europe, and why European leaders share the responsibility to lead us out of the Brexit cul-de-sac and find a path to preserve European unity intact. For the first time since its inception, a nation, and a major one at that, will have disrupted the onward march of European cohesion, left the European Union, and will have done so apparently for reasons of principle at odds with the whole rationale for the Union's existence. Britain without Europe will lose weight and influence, for sure. But Europe without Britain will be smaller and diminished, also for sure. And both of us will be less than we are, and much less than we could be together. In politics, there's a kind of fatalism which can often overwhelm what is right by making the right course seem hopeless or even delusional. So it is with Brexit. In the UK, we are told that the people have spoken, and that to interrogate the question further is treachery. The will of the people is deemed clear and indisputable, though what that will means in practice, given the complexity of Brexit, the multiple interpretations of it, and the differing consequences of each version, is with every day which passes not clear at all. But nonetheless, we're told we must just do it. And in Europe, there is often a sorrowful shaking of heads and a shrugging of shoulders, where what we need is strong, engaged leadership to avoid a rupture which will do lasting damage to us both. Now, I understand European reticence. Until Europe sees real signs that there could be a change of mind in Britain, why should it contemplate the possibility of change in Europe? However, the argument in Britain is far from over. Actually, right now it's in flux. See the speech of Jeremy Corbyn this week. What I call the dilemma of the negotiation, close to Europe to avoid economic damage, but therefore accepting its rules, or free from Europe's rules, but therefore accepting economic damage, is finally prizing open the discourse in Britain. And it's a binary choice. The cake will either be had or be eaten, but it won't be both. And the dilemma then divides the Brexit vote. Many of those who voted Brexit want a clean break from Europe, even if there's economic difficulty as a result, and even if it sours the politics of Ireland. But many others would not want it if there were an economic cost, and would certainly believe that peace in Ireland should be protected. Outside commentary often underestimates the fact that at some point this year, the government have got to put a vote to Parliament and win it. They will, of course, try to fudge. But as we are seeing, this cake is quite resistant to fudge. After last June's general election, winning this vote will be much tougher than is commonly understood. And for once, Parliament in this equation can be more decisive than either government or opposition. There are three legs to the stool upon which could sit a reconsideration of Brexit. The first is to show the British people that what they were told in June 2016 has turned out much more complex, more costly than they thought. This leg is looking increasingly robust as time goes on. The second is to show that there are different and better ways of responding to the genuine underlying grievances beneath the Brexit vote, especially around immigration. This leg is easy to construct, but needs willing workers. The third is an openness on the part of Europe to respond to Brexit by treating it as a wake-up call to change in Europe and not just an expression of British recalcitrance. This is the leg to focus on today. The stool needs all three legs. For Europe, the damage of Brexit is obvious and not so obvious. In obvious terms, though the economic pain for Britain, especially of a clean break Brexit, is large, the cost to Europe is also significant and painful. 1 in 7 German cars, for example, sold in Britain, and goods exports in total are worth 3.5% of German GDP. The figure for Ireland is 14%, for Belgium over 7%. Britain is a huge market for French produce of many kinds, and a top 3 export partner for 10 EU members, including Italy and Spain. For example, around 200,000 Dutch jobs are involved in trade with the UK. There are some 60 direct flights between London and Amsterdam every day. According to the Dutch government agency CPB, a hard Brexit could make every Dutch person around €1,000 poorer. A Europe in which Britain finds it harder to be the financial centre for European business, it will be deeply damaging for Britain, but it will also impede the economy of Europe. Estimates of the long-term effect on European growth vary, depending on the version of Brexit chosen, but they vary from bad to very bad. In short, no one I've spoken to in the investment community, from the United States through to China, thinks this is a good idea for Britain or for Europe. Because of these effects, some in Britain believe that therefore Europe will bend its negotiating stance and allow Britain largely unfettered access to Europe's single market without the necessity of abiding by Europe's rules. This won't happen, quite simply because it can't. To do so would risk unravelling the single market and a return to precisely the system that was in place before Europe wisely and in the interests of its economy, and with, of course, the successive British governments urging, decided to create the single market. But the damage to Europe of a political nature is, to my mind, even more deleterious. For Schuman and other founding fathers, the project of European Union was a project of peace. Cooperation in Europe being the alternative to the wars which had ravaged Europe and the world in the first half of the 20th century. They looked back at the long history of European nations and saw centuries of conflict punctuated by all too brief epochs of relative harmony. From the time of Charlemagne, Europe had come together periodically, but mainly through religion, force, or transitory necessity. There had been an uneasy balance of power arrangement towards the end of the 19th century, but then the rivalries of the great European nations pitched them into a war no one ever thought would prove as devastating as it did. The attempt out of it, then to produce a new political settlement, fell victim to the competing totalitarian ideologies of communism and fascism and the descent into the darkness of World War II. So then, standing on the rubble of destruction, they decided to approach European unity with renewed vigor and vowed to give it institutional and practical meaning. Thus began what has now become the European Union. The rationale for Europe today, however, is not peace but power. For almost 300 years, the world has been dominated by the West. At the beginning of that time, the great powers were European, with colonies and empires. Japan and China were, of course, major nations, but they were not shaping the world. By the end of World War I, the United States had emerged as the most powerful nation, steadily eclipsing the United Kingdom, and stayed that way through the 20th century. But today, the world's changing again. China is today the second largest economy, the biggest global trader, and as holder of huge amounts of American debt, intimately important to global prosperity. Look back at the top economies in the year 2000, not so long ago. Europe dominates the top 10. Germany's was 4 times the size of India's and larger than China's. Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, distant specks on the horizon far behind. By 2016, the situation has already changed dramatically. India's economy is now almost as large as the UK and France. And by 2030, India's economy will be larger than those of Japan or Germany. Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico will be narrowing the gap. China becomes the largest global economy, 7 or 8 times the size of the UK. But then look ahead to 2050, and India is several times the size of the German economy, and no European economy is in the top 6. With this economic change will come political change. The West will no longer dominate. And Europe, to retain the ability to protect its interests and its values, will need to form a strong bloc with the power collectively to do what no European nation alone will be able to do individually. Regard the regions of the world today. Everywhere, in reaction to this fundamental shift of geopolitics, countries are banding together, from Southeast Asia to the continent of Africa. Nations are in a desperate scramble to find their place in a world in which no nation wants to be forced to choose between the big powers or unable to withstand their demands. For Europe, much more is at stake than trade or commerce. So take defense. Yes, NATO remains the cornerstone of Western security policy. But in an era in which the United States, and not only under this administration, is signaling the limits of its appetite for military commitment, and where current events in Turkey show the fragility of some of the assumptions of alliance within NATO, it's foolish, indeed it's dangerous, for Europe not to have the independent capacity to protect its interests. If the Sahel erupts, who will bear the brunt of the eruption? Europe. But who will we be obliged to call upon? The United States. Now, of course, Britain can maintain a close relationship on defense even outside the EU. It still represents 25% of European defense spending. I welcome the British Prime Minister's speech to the Munich conference and the excellent paper recently from the German Council on Foreign Relations. But how much more effective would such cooperation be if we were still part of Europe's decision-making structure? And instead we're in the surreal position of proclaiming our desire for tighter European cooperation in defense, just as we withdraw from Europe's political framework for doing so. How can we police our borders except through common strategy? Or fight terrorism, but through enhanced integration of intelligence and surveillance? Or protect our privacy from either foreign governments or corporate behemoths, other than by the strength which comes from size? Do we seriously believe that if we had approached negotiation on climate change as individual countries rather than as Europe, we would have driven the agenda in the way that we did? But it's more than this. Our values are also going to be in play in the 21st century. Brexit is happening at a pivotal time in Western politics. Parts of our politics are today fragmented, polarized, occasionally paralyzed, with visceral cultural as well as economic rifts, with politicians who strive for answers swept aside by those riding the anger, a sterile policy agenda focusing on who to stigmatize and barely touching the real forces of change, which are technological, and conventional media, locked in an ugly embrace with social media to create a toxic, scandal-driven, rancorous environment for debate, which risks destruction of democracy's soul. Meanwhile, there are new powers emerging who are looking skeptically at Western democracy today and think there may be a different, less democratic model to follow. For the first time, not just our power, but our value system is going to be contested in the 21st century. So at this moment, we need for Europe to regain its confidence, to take courage, to set a course for the future, which rekindles the spirit of optimism. I believe firmly in the transatlantic alliance. Despite what it may sometimes seem, so do most Americans. In the new geopolitics, we need each other for reasons just as compelling as those which thrust us together in the early 20th century. But especially at a time when America appears preoccupied with its own political upheaval, and is hard to read and easy to parody, Europe should be far-sighted enough to keep the alliance strong, to be determined in defending our values from those who would destabilize us, and to send a message to the rest of the world that Europe will grow in power in the 21st century precisely because of those values. None of this can in any way be advanced by Britain's departure from Europe. It rips out of Europe one of the alliance's most sustained advocates. It weakens Europe's standing in power the world over. It reduces the effectiveness of the single market by removing from it Europe's second largest economy. And Britain, out of Europe, will ultimately become a focal point of disunity when the requirement for unity is so manifest. No matter how much we try, it will create a competitive pole to that of Europe, economically and politically, to the detriment of both of us. More contentiously, I believe it risks an imbalance in the delicate compromise that is the European polity. Britain supports the nation-state as the point of originating legitimacy for European integration. Others are more comfortable with the notion of ever closer union, leaving over time to a more federal structure. But the truth is that the anxieties which led to the Brexit vote are felt all over Europe. They're not specific to the British. Read the latest Eurobarometer of public opinion. In many countries, similar referendums might have had similar results. Now, look, I know from experience that Britain is often the argumentative partner who speaks up, but there is frequently a large group of others sheltering behind us, glad that there is a voice in the room articulating what others think but are shy of saying. Even the famed Franco-German motor can need British spare parts and lubricants, even if they come with the odd bit of grit. And from time to time, British mechanics can work with others to create a backup engine. President Macron has sensibly proposed a series of Europe-wide debates on Europe's future in recognition of these strains in European politics. But these will not work, however, if they become merely a way of explaining to European citizens why their worries are misplaced. It should be a real dialogue. The populism convulsing Europe must be understood before it can be defeated. Immigration is a genuine fear with causes which cannot be dismissed. Many feel the European project is too much directed to the enlargement of European institutions rather than to projects which deliver change in people's daily lives. There is much good work done by this and the previous Commission to reduce regulation and bureaucracy, unfortunately usually ignored or overshadowed. But we should recognize this is still an issue to people all over Europe. The things Europe is doing to build its capability to make the lives of Europeans better in energy, digitalization, infrastructure, education, defense and security need to be driven forward with much greater intensity. And the difference between those in the Eurozone and those outside it will require different governance arrangements. So Europe knows it needs to reform. And reform in Europe is key to getting Britain to change its mind. There should surely be a way of aligning those two perspectives. A comprehensive plan on immigration control, which preserves Europe's values, but is consistent with the concerns of its people and includes sensitivity to the challenges of freedom of movement principles, together with a roadmap for future European reform, which recognizes the issues underpinning the turmoil in traditional European politics and is in line with what many European leaders are already advocating. That would be right for Europe and timely for the evolving British debate on Brexit. If at the point Britain is seized of a real choice, not about whether we like Europe or not, the question of June 2016, but whether on mature reflection, the final deal the British government offers is better than what we have now. If at this moment Europe was to offer a parallel path to Brexit of Britain staying in a reforming Europe, that would throw open the whole debate to transformation. Now, people will say it can't happen. To which I say, in these times in politics, anything can happen. In any event, it depends on what magnitude of decision you think this is. There are errors in politics of passing significance, and there are mistakes of destiny. If we believe, and I do, that this is of the latter kind, we cannot afford passive acquiescence. Those whose vision gave rise to the dream of a Europe unified in peace after centuries of war, and whose determination translated that dream into practical endeavor, theirs are the ghosts that should be our inspiration today. They would not have yielded to fatalism, and neither should we. We have months, perhaps weeks, to think, plan, and act. And let's be clear about one final thing. Even if Brexit is Britain's future, and yours is a European Union without Britain, we can't alter our geography, history, or manifold ties of culture and nature. This is a divorce that can never mean a physical separation. We will be consigned to cohabiting the same space, trying to get along, but resenting our differences and reliving what broke us apart, awkward silences at the breakfast table, arguing over the rules with no escape from each other. And here is the supreme irony, actually with so much still in common and still liking each other. So better to make our future work together. If we don't, I believe in time a future generation will. But their verdict on ours will be harsh, for time wasted and opportunity spurned. It doesn't take a miracle. It takes leadership. And now is when we need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll have a couple of questions before opening it up to the audience. You mentioned towards the end that we have months or maybe even only weeks. And we are all aware that we have the Article 50 clock ticking in the background. What needs to be done in these months or weeks, and how can we stop that clock from ticking?
I think what needs to happen is it needs to become clear that there's no escape from the dilemma, what I call the dilemma with a capital D. Either you're close to Europe, but you're going to have to abide by Europe's rules, but that minimizes the economic damage, or you're going your own way, free to create your own rules, but you're not part of the European economic system, and therefore you're going to do big damage to yourself. So that dilemma needs to become clear. It needs to become clear that there is, but I think this is becoming clear, that there is not a majority in Parliament to do damage to our country. And the third thing that needs to happen is that we need to realize, and on both sides, that March 2019 is the date, and it's got to be sorted out before then. But we've spent a year, I think, with the British government basically trying to say there's a way of having our cake and eat it. It's clear there isn't. So I think now is when you're getting an accelerating understanding of what the basic problems are. Northern Ireland obviously shows it very, very clearly. And, I think British opinion will start to move once people realize that this is not about being a tough negotiator or a weak negotiator. This is about a fundamental problem that can't be resolved by the exercise of political maneuvering. It can only be resolved by coming to a choice that's either going to lead you to long-term economic, or certainly short and medium-term economic damage, and possibly long-term economic damage, or alternatively ending up in a situation which I think British people will find very unsatisfactory, of still abiding by Europe's rules but not being a decision maker anymore. This is, if someone can find a way out of that difficulty, I'm ready to hear it, but I can't see it. And that's what I think is going to accelerate this process of reconsideration.
And you were talking about the need for a reformed Europe as well, or maybe a plea for a reformed Europe. What would you say to those who say we've been here before? The renegotiation with David Cameron really was what was on the table in terms of reforms, and it was rejected in the referendum.
Yeah, I think what I'd say is that, in my view, European reform fits into sort of three categories. There's things that I think people across Europe are anxious about, and I would put immigration and people's anxieties about that is the number one question. Okay. And I think a combination of what Europe wants to do, actually, in strengthening its own external borders, and frankly, a mix of Britain enforcing what the rules it can enforce within freedom of movement, but also with some latitude on the European side. I think that, in my view, will go a long way to fixing the immigration anxiety, certainly, that people have in Britain. And that, I think, can be done reasonably quickly, because they're all things that we've discussed over a long period of time. The second area are things that, that I was talking about, like digitalization, infrastructure, common energy, common defense. I mean, Europe is gearing itself up to talk about these questions anyway today. I mean, so it's not as if we're going against the grain of what Europe wants. And in that instance, I think we just need to set out some clear principles of where Europe is going to go. And then thirdly, there's the issues around governance changes within the Eurozone and outside the Eurozone. Most people in Europe understand this has got to happen. So I don't think you need to decide all those now, of course, because that would be far too quick a timetable. But there needs to be a clear sense that the anxieties, not just of British citizens, but of European citizens, are being addressed, and there is a process in place for a Europe that is going to make sense of the different arrangements for different European countries. And then, frankly, it's also a matter of putting what we have in Europe today against what the government's going to offer us. So, you know, look, I know people say to me, this is, you know, sort of Don Quixote exercise, and it's just not possible to change this. But I think the debate in Britain is opening up now. And so the question is, I understand the frustrations there are in Europe, but, you know, we're going to have to find a way, if possible, to make this work because of what I say about the damage to Europe.
Thank you. I'll open it up now to the audience. I'll take 2 or 3 questions together. And if you could please identify who you are and the organization you represent. And I've already got 3 or 4 here, so I'll start with Fraser. Yeah, microphone is just coming.
A very good speech. I remember you did 3 good speeches out of Britain when you were Prime Minister. And my question really is to the audience that you once represented in the northeast of England, which was one of the highest Leave votes. Do you think the arguments you put forward today are sufficient to change their views in terms of, you know, getting their support for this Europe? And also, where is the leadership you advocated at the very end going to come from?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm John Wiles, Senior Advisor to the EPC.
First of all, thank you for an excellent speech. I've
been thrilling with confirmation bias when you wrote. Very difficult for many of us here to take exception to anything you said. But you have said made some very interesting and fascinating observations. And the one I just wanted to ask you about is that you postulate a Brexit Britain as emerging as a competing pole to the Union. Could you just elaborate on that a bit more, and indeed, you know, how destructive it might become? Thank you.
And I'll take one more.
Thank you. Mark Johnston. Mr. Blair, 20 years ago when you became Prime Minister, you charmed the press barons in order that the new Labour programme could go ahead. Many of those same press barons today continue to pour poison into the public debate in the UK about this situation. So far as I can recall, you've never called them out for that behaviour. Why is that so, and would you be prepared to do so now, given all that there is at stake? Thank you very much.
Right. So that's... Even though we're in Brussels, I think those are 3 British questions.
Come to the other ones.
But they're very good questions, actually. So I represented a constituency in the north of England that voted substantially to leave. My successor was a strong advocate of Remain. He's stayed a strong advocate of Remain. And, you know, I actually think a much better position for the Labour Party to be in today is to say what it really believes, which is that Brexit is not an answer to the problems that people have. If you're someone who's worried about unemployment, lack of opportunity, communities left behind, Brexit is going to make all those problems worse. In fact, Brexit affects regions like the north of England much worse than it does regions in the south, like London. And, you know, at some point, I think the most powerful thing to say about Brexit, if we were, you know, if I was back in politics today and leader of the opposition, which is an unlikely hypothesis, I know, but if I was, I would be hammering the Tories all the time, not just on the destructive impact of Brexit, but on the distractive impact of Brexit. I mean, all the big problems of the country don't get dealt with because there is no energy to deal with anything other than Brexit. And if you're in the north east of England, what are you worried about? You're worried about the health service, you're worried about the economy, you're worried about jobs. So we we could be making that case so powerfully, and I believe in the end, you know, this is an argument that can persuade large numbers of people. You're never going to persuade the people, but they are a minority who have this view that Britain has got to be out of Europe because that's what will allow Britain to become what it once was. You're never going to persuade those people. But there are other people in that coalition that brought us Brexit who did a cost-benefit analysis and, for example, believed that if they got out of Brexit, there was £350 million a week extra for the health service. Right? Turns out that there's not. There's actually less money for the health service because our growth rates are down. Those people are persuadable, and I think they could be persuaded if we took a strong leadership position. To the question about Britain as a competing pole of power, you see, if Britain comes out of Europe, and we come out of the single market and customs union, inevitably we are going to have to restructure our economy. We're going to have to market ourselves differently as a country. At the moment, you know, we have attracted vast amounts of investment into Britain on the basis that we're a, you know, people like the language, they like the culture, they quite like the British, and it's a good place to be for the European market. You get out of all of that, you're going to have to find a different way forward, right? And I think even though the rest of Europe will say we don't want this, and the British government is already saying we don't want this, and David Davis made his speech the other week, but we're going to be driven to it because, and by the way, the people really behind this Brexit project, that's what they want. Their dislike of Europe is the political culture of Europe. You know, their dislike of Europe is all this stuff about solidarity and human rights and this kind of general social democratic climate of opinion in Europe. They don't like it. Right? What they think is that the Thatcherite revolution in Britain was never fully completed, and this is their chance to complete it. And so for them, Brexit is the first step in a two-step change in Britain. The next step is indeed to get Britain to compete on the basis of saying, look at these Europeans, they've got all this regulation and bureaucracy, and we're Britain. Right? So look, whatever people say, I think this is what would happen. And the destructive impact of that will be immense, because it will weaken Europe, it will cause great stresses and strains. I mean, you know, I was just reflecting yesterday. I mean, I came from, by the train from London to Brussels. It's a shorter journey than that is from going from London to where you did your PhD in Edinburgh. I mean, we're going to be in this crazy situation where we're literally on, you know, right in the same geographical space with each other with all these ties. And yet, if we're out of those European markets and out of the political structures of Europe, we'll be constantly looking for ways of demonstrating our relevance and demonstrating that it was the right thing to have done. Right. So I think this is, I'm afraid I think this is inevitable if we go ahead with this, despite what anyone says, and I think it will be bad for both of us. And finally, on the press barons, actually, I have made it very clear recently in what I agree was a departure from where I was at the beginning of my time as Prime Minister. This is what I call the media cartel on the right of the British media. Just this has been a major factor in creating this sort of toxic atmosphere around Europe, of sustaining the Brexit campaign, and of now, by the way, if you read those newspapers in Britain, by the way, you'd think that the whole thing's going really well. I mean, these Europeans are obviously unreasonable, but, you know, apart from them, as it were, it's going very well. But the one thing, you know, there aren't, my differences with Jeremy Corbyn are well known, but the one thing I do think about the last election is it also showed the limits of their ability to swing opinion, but it's still a very powerful factor, and in my view, it's a very regressive factor.
Thank you. A lot of hands. First here. The microphone's just coming.
Thank you. My name is Paul Adamson. Just now, Tony, you mentioned when talking about immigration and free movement, the need for latitude, your choice of word, on the part of EU27. You may be a Don Quixote, but you're quite a strategic Don Quixote, I suspect. Based on the chat you've had with Europe's leaders in the past few months, how confident are you that that kind of latitude would in the end be forthcoming? Thank you.
Okay. There was one behind you as well.
Tony, thank you for your speech. Tom Park from the British Chamber of Commerce in Belgium. You touched upon the notion of European reform. There are different models out there. Today, the IPPR is presenting a shared market model. There's the Continental Partnership. I'd be interested in your perspectives on what sort of reform we're looking at, aside from the migration question. Thank you.
And just there as well, and then I'll come back to the others.
Hi, Ellie Mears from International Politics and Society. You talked about European reform and that a big part of that is reforming the immigration system and coming up with a comprehensive system. How do you then square the circle of there being two very different outlooks in terms of immigration in Europe? So you've got initially in places like Germany, there was a big welcome for refugees, and of course we do have a massive war on our doorstep. But then you also have the Eastern European countries who would say that culturally they're not ready to take in refugees from other countries. How do you, in a comprehensive migration plan, how do you actually reconcile those two views?
Right. Paul, first of all, on the issue of freedom of movement, you know, from my discussions with European leaders, if they thought that Britain was really serious about staying within Europe, then I think there would be a combination of a better deal from Europe than the one David Cameron was able to secure, but also, and I think very important, an understanding that Britain was going to have to apply the freedom of movement rules more vigorously. Now, you know, it's very important to be, again, we should be open with the British people about this. Successive governments for a long period of time prioritised the economy over controlling migration. We did it, by the way, for perfectly sensible reasons. You know, we had a booming economy, and actually when you do an analysis of European migrant workers, it turns out we need most of them. And actually when you go through the categories, we've now got a problem in our health service today because of the downturn of European migrant workers. We need the seasonal workers, we need the high-skilled workers, and we need the students. The only category you come across when you really analyse these figures are the people who come to Britain looking for work, most of whom I suspect end up working in bars and food processing and restaurants in London and the South. But, you know, if we wanted to as Britain, we could do what they do in Belgium, which is essentially to say, look, you've got to find work within a couple of months, and if you don't, you can go back. So there's a lot of changes that could be made if we really wanted to make them. And I think this is obviously something for negotiation, but my feeling from talking to other European leaders is that people recognise immigration as a problem in the whole of Europe, and they would be, if the price of European unity was addressing some of these issues, they would do it. I mean, I think in respect, Tom, of what you're talking about in reform in Europe, I mean, I think the reforms are of two sorts, apart from what I was just saying on immigration. I think they are these institutional questions that are bound to be important because of the changes to the Eurozone that many people are proposing. Right? So this is a common in the European debate. But the other thing is, you know, I think, you know, I've said this for a long, long time in Europe, that one of the things we've got to try and do is present an agenda for change in Europe which coincides with what most people in Europe would think is going to improve their own lives. And by the way, there are lots of things that Europe does that it never kind of talks about in the right way, which would make a real difference. I mean, let me give you some examples. Digitalization. You know, we actually need, why is it that Europe's not got big tech titans in the same way that America has, because we haven't created a genuine single market in the digital sphere. You know, you look at common energy policy. A true common energy policy would reduce our costs enormously, right? We could do that. Education today is not just about educating people. It's also a major part of certainly of the British economy, and I think of the European economy. There's much more we could do together in that sphere. Or if you talk about energy supply, in fact, Europe has today some quite bold plans as to how it's going to ensure its security of supply in the years to come. We could be making much, much more of these things for the people of Europe. And that means more to them than, frankly, some of the more arcane institutional disputes that often dominate questions of European reform. But what we won't be able to do, and this is, you see, I don't quite know what the IPPR is suggesting today, but I know a lot of people in Britain are suggesting forms of cooperation outside of the European Union for Britain and Europe, which mean that we would still align ourselves with European rules. Now, the one thing I am absolutely certain of politically, I'm certain of this, is any compromise, and this is part of the problem the government has, any compromise that involves us abiding by European rules, but outside of Europe, is never going to attract the British people. And you will find, if it happens, you will find a large number of British people, and this is the whole point, then divide into two camps. Right? There will be those that say, that's not good enough, we want a clean break. Yeah, okay, it's going to cause us damage, we'll just take the damage. But there's another group of people that will say, in that case, we might as well stay. And this is the problem. You know, what the British government is trying to do is to square that circle. The whole time they come back to the same thing. And it's a kind of weird thing. You know, because the European negotiators, you know, they're trying to talk cars with the British government. Right? Now, the car can be this size or that size. It can have this attribute or that attribute. It can even be steering wheel on the left hand or the right hand. Right? But every time the British negotiators turn up, they say, well, here, we'll offer you a donkey. And the Europeans say, no, we're talking cars here. And they say, okay. So then they go away, and then they come back a few weeks later, and they say, but I tell you what, we found a really pretty donkey. It's not going to work. Right? So this is why the reform in Europe, in the end, it only really works, in my view, if it's for the British, if it's a reform for the whole of Europe with Britain staying. I think a reform in Europe that ends up with some sort of Britain half in, half out, I just don't think that's ever going to work. And finally, on the immigration question, well, look, I think it's a really good question, but here's my feeling. I think even in Germany, there's quite a lot of anxiety about immigration questions. And what is the problem with immigration? The problem is that there's no doubt that overall it's a good thing for an economy. You look at the successful economies of the world, there's immigration. You know, you look, for example, we're talking technology. You look at the big companies, technology in Silicon Valley. Think how many of those businesses have been started by migrants. Massive number. If I think of the two leading companies in the UK in artificial intelligence, both of them started by migrants. Okay. So immigration, you know, improves economies because it brings in new energy and vitality and ideas and innovation. And, you know, you remember, those of you young up to, when Japan was going to overtake the world and become the great power. I remember in the 1980s, Japan was the great thing, right? So if we fast forward to today, one of the reasons why Japan has not succeeded in the way people thought then is because of the absence of immigration. Right? So immigration is basically a good thing for a country, but it's a big change. And if you want to make immigration work, the way of dealing with it, and the dilemma you quite rightly raise, is, in my view, you've got to have rules so that you don't have prejudices. But if you don't have rules, you stimulate the climate for prejudice. And the real problem that people have with immigration is they kind of look at what's happening on Europe's borders and they think, you know, we can't really control this, it's all coming in, and then people worry. They worry about the change in their society. Now, I personally think in the UK's case, the worry is much less to do with immigration from within Europe than from outside Europe. Particularly, again, to be very blunt about it and frank about it, migration from majority Muslim countries where people are anxious about whether those that come in share the same value system. It's a problem. You know, I think there is a way of dealing with the problem, but it requires us to understand that the fears about immigration are not all prejudice. There are genuine anxieties. You've got to deal with the anxieties so you can resist the prejudice. But if you just kind of say, well, if you're raising immigration, you're just an idiot or you're prejudiced, I think it's very difficult. Then I think you lose the argument. And I think if you look around, you know, in the Italian debate today, in the Italian election, how big an issue is immigration? In my experience in Italy, it's a big, big factor driving this. So I think, you know, if Europe takes a really strong, clear position on immigration, which distinguishes clearly between rules and prejudices, then I think we can come through it. But I think it would be a big mistake to think this is only about Eastern Europe or only about Britain. I think it's a general problem, and it can only be dealt with by, you know, a far-sighted policy that has an understanding of people's desire for control at the same time as a complete identification of European values of solidarity and basic human rights and so on.
Thank you. Prime Minister, if I understood correctly, Faruk Kaymakçı, Ambassador of Turkey to the EU, if I understood correctly, you partly blame the EU side for the Brexit. Did I understand correctly? In the negotiations right now, do you feel that EU is not doing enough to keep Britain in because they are saying that they are sorry? But if they are sorry, should they do more, you know, to give some sort of option to Britain? Are they giving it to? My second question, I hope the Brexit will not happen, but if it happens, how do you see the unity of the United Kingdom? Are we going to see a second Scottish referendum? Are we going to see Northern Ireland getting closer to Republic of Ireland than to United Kingdom or England? How do you see this? And of course, if at the end, if it happens, the Brexit, Turkey is ready to fill the gap. Thank you.
Okay.
Jan Wilker, working on the StartNet youth employment project. As you know, young people were particularly in favor of a Remain vote, though they will be heavily concerned by a hard Brexit that will compromise their long-term future. That's why there's a certain sense of betrayal about many young Brits. How much importance there is in the coming weeks and months to especially rely on empowering and listening to young people's voice in a debate for a second Brexit referendum or not Brexit?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. In front here, please. No, behind you, Andrew. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Thanks for another great speech. I wanted to ask you something about the euro. You spoke mostly about the migration, about the single market, but would you think that the fact that the UK is not a part of the euro, and there's no leader, even half leader, in the UK who has been advocating for entry of the UK in the euro, do you think that this is really a difficulty? That, in a sense, the UK outside of the euro was never and would never be at the center of the European project as it has evolved, because the European project is not anymore just about, it is also obviously about the single market, but it is about something more. Yeah. And is that not a danger that the euro being, the UK being on the margin of the European project as it is in 2018, there is nonetheless this difficulty of the UK. And does that not mean that we need to have a project between Europe and the UK about what puts us together, which is the single market. It's not the EU, but it's the single market part of the EU.
Yeah.
And is that not the way we need to think of the future relationship?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, first question from our Turkish colleague was very nicely put, I thought, at the end there. And I always remember there have been when I had the presidency of the European Union, beginning the accession negotiations with Turkey, but a little bit's changed since then, let's say. But no, look, I don't. I think the European negotiators are doing what they're being called upon by Europe to do. I think the one thing I would say is that if it looks like, because obviously this is very apparent to me, in Britain the whole debate is Brexit. Every day Brexit. I mean, even I, wake up, it's Brexit again. I mean, there is a Groundhog Day quality that comes to this. But I'm acutely aware of the fact that if you're in Germany or France or Italy, you're not talking about Brexit the whole time. But what I would say is that if it looks like Britain is genuinely opening up the debate in the way I've described, if I'm right and it's going to become increasingly clear that the government's going to find it really hard to get a proposition through Parliament, then at that point I think it's very important that Europe also recognises, as the purpose of the speech today, look, if we can avoid this, it's also good for us. We're not doing Britain simply a favour, it's actually going to be damaging for Europe if Brexit goes ahead. So that's the right way to look at it. And I think in respect of the UK, at one level I think short term, even if Brexit happens, even if the worst type of Brexit happens, you're not going to break the UK up. Short term. But I think long term it will impose real strains, because there is no answer to this Irish border question, by the way. But people keep treating the Irish border question as if it were separate from the overall dilemma. It's not. It's a metaphor for the overall dilemma. The problem you've got in Northern Ireland is precisely the problem you will have when you come to the financial service sector. You're either in the single market and in the rules, and then that's fine, or you're out of it, in which case it's going to be damaging. And I think in time, therefore, my worry is not in the immediate term, my worry is over time, and likewise with Scotland. So, that's where we are. I think in respect of young people, I think this is a big issue. I mean, I met a group of young people the other day who formed themselves into one of the several groups now of young people who are agitating to have a final say on the deal. And, I do think, I know this from my own children. I mean, I think they do feel, look, they can see the way the world's changing much easier, I think, than the older generation, because they're sort of comfortable with the notion of difference. I mean, I always say to people, when I was growing up in the north of England, in County Durham, I remember the day, and I was 12 years old, when I met my first person who wasn't white. Now, if I look round the sort of the table at one of my youngest son's birthday parties, he's 17 now, but through the years, there have been people, different face, different colours, different ethnicity, and it's been natural. So I think young people find this world a lot less, that's not what frightens them about the world, actually. It's not the difference. It's opportunity, it's worries about, UK constitution fees, things like this. And therefore, I think for young people, yes, I think there is a profound sense of betrayal. And, one of the things I think is important, if we do get to a final say on the deal, is that there's a real dialogue between the generations where the young people say to the older generation, come on, this is our future. Anyway, we'll see. The final question about the euro, I think, is a very difficult but very pertinent question. Look, my view about the euro was always that politically it was absolutely the right thing for Britain. My worry was always about the economics. And I think you know, very frankly, if you look back at the creation of the Eurozone, probably it would have been better if it had been created in a more organic way. And I remember vividly the dinner that we had when I was first president of the European Union in 1998, I think. And we had, and this was pre-enlargement, and we had all the European leaders round the table. And I was trying to sort of raise the argument, because I'd come into power. We weren't going to join the euro, but I was keen to leave the door open at a future time if Britain came to the view that it was the right thing to do. And I was kind of putting the question of whether it wouldn't be better to start with a core of European countries and build up from those. And I remember the Swedish Prime Minister at the time coming in and giving a very eloquent and, as it turned out, quite prescient analysis of what the future problems of the euro might be. And I remember it because Helmut Kohl used to come to these meetings and was a large presence in the room, right? And the thing I always remember about him is everyone else had the napkin on the knee. He'd always put his napkin, tuck it in there, and he'd sit there and he'd eat away. And I remember we were having this discussion, and he just put down his knife and fork and said, no, we're going to do this together. Everyone's going to be in at the same time. It's a political project. It's not just about economics, and that's what's going to happen. So that's what happened. And I think, you know, history will debate the correctness of that or otherwise, but I completely sort of got the politics, but I think the economics is an issue. Now, I think going forward, I think you're right that what we can do is to concentrate on how you actually complete the single market in a way that lays actually a stronger foundation for the single currency. Because there are many areas of the single market not yet completed. And you know, one of the things that is most frustrating for people like myself about the whole Brexit debate is the extraordinary irony that the two things that the British governments, Labour or Conservative, always agreed on and always fought for was the single market and enlargement. And now we reach a situation where with Brexit, the reason we say we want Brexit is because of the migrants from Eastern Europe, and we want out of the single market because that means we have to abide by the single market's rules. It's an extraordinary thing that we've come to. And I do believe if this relationship can be repaired, it will be important to focus on that. And yes, you're right. Of course, there's going to be a difference with the Eurozone countries. But I think that's going to happen anyway. And, you know, in the end, there's still several countries outside the Eurozone and will stay, you know, for the foreseeable future at least outside the Eurozone. So, you know, I think this can be made to work in a way that's to the benefit of both of us with the right foresight and vision, and accepting, as we will have to accept, that there's going to be different tiers of integration. Now, I don't want, you know, I'm not keen on concepts of two-speed Europe type of thing. I think you've got to remain with the flexibility, but there's no doubt, and already this is true, there's going to be a greater integration of the countries inside the Eurozone than those that aren't in it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I know there were a lot of people who still wanted to come in, but maybe we can continue this debate at a future point. I remember about 16 months ago we had President Tusk saying to us that the only alternative to a hard Brexit was no Brexit. 16 months on, we still have that debate. But as he said, time is very short, and we have months, maybe weeks, to see whether it will be no Brexit. If it is not no Brexit, then probably